November 2nd, 2007, 7:15 p.m. The Apollo Theater, Harlem, New York. Red carpet, flashbulbs, celebrities, press everywhere. The premiere of American Gangster, the Ridley Scott film starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas, the drug kingpin who claimed to have been Bumpy Johnson's protege. Frank Lucas was there, 87 years old now, walking slowly but proudly down the red carpet, shaking hands, posing for photos, telling reporters about his days as Bumpy's right-hand man. "Bumpy taught me everything," Lucas told one reporter. "I was his driver for 15 years, his student, his friend. When he died in my arms." The reporter ate it up, wrote it down. This was gold. The real Frank Lucas, talking about the legendary Bumpy Johnson. But 50 feet away, standing in the shadows near the theater entrance, was a 93-year-old woman in an elegant black dress. Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's widow, and she was furious. She'd been watching Lucas give interviews for the past hour, watching him tell lies about her husband, watching him claim a relationship that never existed. And she'd had enough. When Lucas finished his interview and started walking toward the theater entrance, Mayme stepped forward. "Mr. Lucas," she said. Her voice was quiet but carried weight. Lucas stopped, turned, saw her. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, guilt, recognition. But then he smiled. "Mrs. Johnson, it's good to see you. Is it?" Mayme's voice was ice. "Because I've been listening to you tell lies about my husband for the past hour." The reporters nearby sensed blood in the water. Cameras turned. Microphones extended. This was about to get interesting. "Lies," Lucas said, still smiling but looking uncomfortable now. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean." Mayme stepped closer. "You've been telling people you were Bumpy's driver for 15 years, that you were his protege, that he died in your arms." He didn't." Mayme's voice cut through like a knife. "My husband died in the arms of Junie Bird, his childhood friend, at Wells Restaurant. You weren't there." Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but Mayme wasn't done. "You weren't at the wake. You weren't at the funeral. I don't even know where you were, but you certainly weren't with my husband when he died." The cameras were rolling now. Every major news outlet, entertainment shows. This was no longer just a movie premiere. This was a widow defending her husband's legacy. "Mrs. Johnson," Lucas said carefully, "I understand you might not have known about everything Bumpy." "Don't." Mayme's finger came up. "Don't you dare tell me what I did or didn't know about my own husband. I was married to that man for 20 years. I knew his friends. I knew his business. And I know you were never his driver." A reporter jumped in. "Mr. Lucas, how do you respond to Mrs. Johnson's claims?" Lucas looked trapped. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be his night, his movie, his story. "Bumpy kept his home life and business separate," Lucas said finally. "Mrs. Johnson wouldn't have known about everything." "You're right about one thing," Mayme interrupted. "Bumpy did keep things separate, which is why I know for a fact that his real friends, Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, Sonny Chance, Finkley Hoskins, those were the men he trusted. Those were the men he spent time with. You were nobody to him." The silence was deafening. "Mrs. Johnson," another reporter called out, "are you saying the movie is false?" Mayme turned to the cameras. "I'm saying that Frank Lucas is a liar. He wasn't Bumpy's driver. He wasn't his protege. He wasn't there when Bumpy died. And this movie," she gestured toward the theater, "is based on lies. On a fantasy that Frank Lucas has been telling for years because he wanted to be more important than he was." She turned back to Lucas. "My husband was a great man. He had his faults, but he was loyal. He was smart. He took care of Harlem. And he would be disgusted to know that a man like you is using his name to sell a fairy tale." Then she walked away, into the theater, to watch a movie about a lie. And behind her, Frank Lucas stood frozen on the red carpet, cameras still rolling, his carefully constructed story crumbling in real time. November 5th, 2007, 2 p.m., Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Harlem. Mayme Johnson sat at a table with her co-author, Karen E. Quinones Miller. Behind them was a banner, "Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson." Her book, published in February 2008. But she moved up the press conference to respond to the movie. The room was packed. Reporters, historians, Harlem residents, people who'd known Bumpy, people who wanted the truth. Mayme adjusted her glasses and began. Thank you all for coming. I call this press conference because I need to set the record straight about my husband and about Frank Lucas. She opened a folder, pulled out documents. This is Bumpy's prison record from Alcatraz. He was sentenced in 1952. 15 years for drug conspiracy. He served 11 years. Released in 1963. She held up the document for the cameras. Frank Lucas claims he was Bumpy's driver for 13 years, 9 months, and 8 days. Let's do the math. Bumpy was in prison from 1952 to 1963. That's 11 years where Frank couldn't possibly have been his driver. She pulled out another document. When Bumpy got out in 1963, he only lived 5 more years. He died July 7th, 1968. 5 years. Not 13. Not 15. 5. A reporter raised her hand. Mrs. Johnson, is it possible Lucas was his driver before 1952? Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem around 1946 or 1947, Mayme said. By his own admission, he didn't immediately start working with Bumpy. So even if we're generous and say he knew Bumpy for 6 years before prison, that's still only 11 years total if you include the 5 years after prison. Not 13 years, 9 months, and 8 days. She paused. Let that sink in. But here's the real issue. Frank Lucas was never Bumpy's driver. Period. Bumpy drove himself. Or when he needed a ride, his friends drove him. Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, people he trusted. Then who was Frank Lucas? Another reporter asked. Mayme's expression hardened. Frank was a flunky. Someone who did small jobs. Someone Bumpy never fully trusted. Bumpy told me himself. Frank is a liar, and it's easier to trust a thief than a liar. The room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Johnson, someone called out. Why would Frank Lucas lie about this? Mayme smiled sadly. Because all the people who could contradict him are dead. Junie Bird died in 1998. Nat Pettigrew died in 1995. Finkley Hoskins died in 2001. Sonny Chance died in 2003. Frank waited until everyone who knew the truth was gone. Then he started telling his lies. She pulled out a final document. A death certificate. This is Bumpy's death certificate. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. Time of death. 2:14 a.m. Witness, Junie Bird. She looked directly at the cameras. Not Frank Lucas. Junie Bird, Bumpy's childhood friend. The man who actually was there. Within hours, Mayme's press conference was everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Bet, New York One, every major outlet. The headline, Bumpy Johnson's widow calls Frank Lucas a liar. Entertainment Weekly ran a feature. American Gangster, Fact or Fiction? The New York Times published an investigation, examining Frank Lucas's claims about Bumpy Johnson. And suddenly, Frank Lucas was on the defensive. He gave an interview to Hot 97 FM with Miss Jones. Look, Lucas said, sounding frustrated, Mayme is a nice lady, but she didn't know everything about Bumpy's business. He kept home separate from work. I worked with Bumpy. She didn't see that side. Miss Jones pressed him. But the timeline doesn't work. Bumpy was in prison for 11 years. I visited him, Lucas interrupted. I went to Alcatraz. We stayed in touch. But you weren't his driver while he was in prison. Silence. Mr. Lucas? I was his driver before and after, Lucas said finally. The relationship continued. That's what matters. But it wasn't just the timeline that was falling apart. Reporters started interviewing other people who'd known Bumpy. An old numbers runner named Willie Patterson told the Amsterdam News. Frank Lucas? Yeah, I knew him. He was around. But he wasn't nobody special to Bumpy. Bumpy had his circle. Frank wasn't in it. A former NYPD detective, speaking anonymously, told the Daily News, Lucas is inflating his relationship with Johnson. We investigated both of them. Lucas was small-time compared to Bumpy. He wasn't the heir apparent. He wasn't the protege. He was just another hustler. Even people in the film industry started questioning the story. A federal judge who'd presided over Lucas's trial in the 1970s gave an interview to New York Magazine. The movie American Gangster is 1% reality and 99% Hollywood. Frank Lucas wasn't the criminal mastermind portrayed in the film, and his relationship with Bumpy Johnson was greatly exaggerated. The carefully constructed legend was crumbling. February 2008. Mayme's book, Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, was released. It became a bestseller immediately. People wanted the truth. They want to know the real story of Bumpy Johnson, not the Hollywood version, not Frank Lucas's fantasy. The real story. Mayme went on a book tour. Harlem bookstores, libraries, community centers. At every stop, she told the truth about Bumpy. At the Human Bookstore on 125th Street, she read from Chapter 12, The Final Years. Bumpy's last night was July 6th, going into July 7th, 1968. We had watched the Lawrence Welk show together. Then Bumpy said he wanted to go out. Junie Bird came to pick him up. They went to Wells' restaurant. She looked up at the audience. Around 2 a.m., I got a phone call. It was Junie, crying, screaming. Mayme, Bumpy's gone. He had a heart attack. He died in my arms. Her voice cracked. I rushed to Harlem Hospital, but it was too late. My husband was gone. She closed the book. Frank Lucas wasn't there. He wasn't at the hospital. He wasn't at the wake. He wasn't at the funeral. He wasn't part of Bumpy's life in any meaningful way. And I won't let him rewrite history. The audience stood and applauded. But the question remained, what was Frank Lucas's actual relationship with Bumpy Johnson? To understand that, you have to understand Bumpy's world in the 1960s. By the time Bumpy got out of Alcatraz in 1963, he was 58 years old, tired, worn down by 11 years in prison. He came back to a changed Harlem. Drugs everywhere. Heroin flooding the streets. The Italian mafia had broken their agreement and turned the neighborhood into an open-air drug market. Bumpy tried to restore order, but he was aging. His power was waning, and there were young hustlers everywhere, trying to make names for themselves, trying to get close to the legend. Frank Lucas was one of those hustlers. He was around. He ran some numbers. He did small jobs. He was in the same circles. But he wasn't special. He wasn't chosen. He wasn't the heir. According to Mayme's book, Bumpy actually took another young man under his wing during those final years, Flash Walker. Flash was smart, Mayme wrote. Respectful. Loyal. Bumpy saw potential in him. They talked for hours. Bumpy would teach him strategy, how to think long-term, how to keep order. But Flash Walker died young, in the early 1970s. And with Flash gone, Frank Lucas saw an opportunity. He took the relationship he'd witnessed between Bumpy and Flash and claimed it as his own. Frank watched how Bumpy treated Flash. Mayme explained in an interview. He saw the mentorship, the respect, and after everyone was dead, Frank said, "That was me. I was the one Bumpy chose." But it wasn't true. For decades, Frank Lucas's story went unchallenged. Why? Because the people who could contradict him were all dead. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Junie Bird died in 1998. Nat Pettigrew died in 1995. Finkley Hoskins died in 2001. Sonny Chance died in 2003. By the time Frank Lucas started doing major interviews, especially the 2000 New York Magazine article by Mark Jacobson that became the basis for American Gangster, there was nobody left to say, wait, that's not how it happened. Except Mayme. But she was an old woman, widowed, living quietly in Philadelphia. And Frank Lucas was charismatic, a good storyteller. He had details, specific dates, vivid memories. People believed him, especially Hollywood. When Denzel Washington signed on to play Frank Lucas, it legitimized the story. When Ridley Scott directed the film, it became history. Except it wasn't history. It was fiction. The American Gangster movie did something terrible to Bumpy Johnson's legacy. It reduced him to a supporting character in Frank Lucas's story. In the film, Bumpy appears briefly, dies early, exists only to set up Lucas's rise. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't a supporting character. He was the main character. For 40 years, he was the man who negotiated with Lucky Luciano as an equal. He was the man who survived 5 years of war with Dutch Schultz. He was the man who ran Harlem with intelligence, strategy, and respect. He was the man who protected his community, gave back, made sure kids stayed in school, made sure families had food. He was complex, flawed, violent when necessary, but also principled, loyal, smart. And Frank Lucas's lie erased all of that. It made Bumpy a plot device, a stepping stone, a means to an end. That's what Mayme was fighting against. Not just the lie about Frank's relationship with Bumpy, but the lie about who Bumpy was. After Mayme's press conference and book release, public opinion shifted. Film critics started reassessing American Gangster. Roger Ebert wrote, "The film is entertaining, but how much of it is true?" According to Bumpy Johnson's widow, very little. The Village Voice published a piece titled, "American Gangster's Greatest Fiction, Frank Lucas's Relationship with Bumpy Johnson." Even Denzel Washington was asked about it in interviews. "I played the character as written," Washington said diplomatically. "But I understand Mrs. Johnson's concerns. She knew her husband better than anyone." Frank Lucas tried to fight back. He gave more interviews, insisted his story was true, said Mayme was mistaken. But the damage was done. People started asking questions, doing research, comparing timelines. And the more they looked, the more Lucas's story fell apart. Then things got worse for Lucas. A group of retired DEA agents who'd actually worked the case against Lucas in the 1970s came forward. They were angry because American Gangster portrayed Lucas as turning in corrupt cops, as being the key informant who brought down bad cops. But according to the DEA agents, that wasn't true either. Lucas gave up drug dealers, one retired agent told the press. Lots of them, over 100, but he didn't give up cops. The movie made that up. The real hero of the case, Detective Richie Roberts, played by Russell Crowe in the film, also pushed back. "The movie exaggerates my role and Frank's role," Roberts said. "The investigation was much bigger than just me and him. The DEA did most of the work." Even the coffin story, Lucas's claim that he smuggled heroin in coffins of dead American soldiers for Vietnam, was questioned. "We never found evidence of that," a DEA agent said. "It's a great story, makes for good cinema, but we don't think it happened." Frank Lucas was being exposed, not just about Bumpy, about everything. His entire legend was built on exaggerations and lies. By 2009, Mayme Johnson had won the battle for Bumpy's legacy. Her book was a bestseller. Her interviews were everywhere. When people Googled Bumpy Johnson, they found Mayme's story alongside Frank's claims. The truth was out there. Bumpy's real friends, Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, Sonny Chance, were being remembered. And Frank Lucas? His reputation was shattered. He still did interviews occasionally, still insisted his story was true, but nobody really believed him anymore. In a 2010 interview with Vlad TV, Lucas was asked directly, "Did you make up your relationship with Bumpy?" He got defensive, angry. "I didn't make up nothing. Bumpy and I were close. Very close. People just don't understand." But the timeline works. Lucas snapped. "You're believing Mayme over me. Mayme has documents, prison records, death certificates." Lucas went silent. Because what could he say? Documents don't lie. Frank Lucas lived until 2019, died at age 88. In his final years, he mostly stayed out of the public eye. The American Gangster moment had come and gone. The fame had faded. And what was he left with? A reputation as a liar. Because that's what happens when you build your legacy on lies. Eventually, the truth comes out. Eventually, someone like Mayme Johnson stands up and says, "No, that's not how it happened." And when that happens, you lose more than credibility. You lose your place in history. Because Frank Lucas could have been remembered for what he actually was, a successful drug dealer who built a significant operation in Harlem in the 1970s. That's notable. That's real. But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted to be Bumpy's protege, Bumpy's heir, the chosen one. So he lied. And in lying, he destroyed his own legacy. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's real legacy lived on. Not through Frank Lucas, but through the people who actually knew him. Through Mayme's book, through the oral histories of Harlem residents who remembered him, through the stories passed down about the man who protected Harlem, who kept order, who made sure kids went to school and families had food on Thanksgiving. In 2019, the TV series Godfather of Harlem premiered on EPIX. Forrest Whitaker played Bumpy. And this time, the show was based on Mayme's book, on the real story, not Frank Lucas's fantasy, but the truth about Bumpy Johnson, his complexity, his violence, his intelligence, his loyalty, his flaws, his principles, the real man. That's Bumpy's legacy, not as a supporting character in someone else's lie, but as himself, the godfather of Harlem. Mayme Johnson died on May 1st, 2009, 94 years old. She lived long enough to see Bumpy's legacy restored, long enough to expose Frank Lucas's lies, long enough to make sure the truth was documented. And in doing so, she taught us something important. She taught us that lies might work for a while. They might become movies. They might become legend. But truth has a way of surviving. Truth has people like Mayme, people who refuse to let history be rewritten, people who stand up with documents and dates and say, no, that's not what happened. And when those people speak, the lies crumble. Because you can fool Hollywood. You can fool reporters. You can fool the public. But you can't fool the widow who was there. You can't fool the woman who watched her husband die in Junie Bird's arms. You can't fool Mayme Johnson. Looking back, November 5th, 2007, that press conference at the Schomburg Center was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Mayme said, enough. That was the moment she stood up with documents and dates and witnesses and said, Frank Lucas is a liar. And the world listened. Because she wasn't just defending her husband. She was defending truth itself. She was saying, history matters. Facts matter. You can't just make up a story and call it real because it sounds good. That takes courage. To stand up at 93 years old. To challenge a major Hollywood movie. To go against Denzel Washington and Ridley Scott and Frank Lucas. To say, I don't care how big this movie is. I don't care how famous you are. This is a lie, and I won't let it stand. That's legacy. Not Bumpy's legacy. Mayme's legacy. The woman who fought for truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Today, if you search for Bumpy Johnson, you'll find two stories. You'll find Frank Lucas's version, the movie, the legend, the lie about being Bumpy's protege. And you'll find the truth. Mayme's book, the documented evidence, the real story of Bumpy Johnson's life. Both exist online. Both are part of history now. But there's a difference. One is labeled fiction. The other is labeled truth. And that difference matters. Because Frank Lucas might have gotten his movie. He might have gotten his moment of fame. But Mayme Johnson got something more valuable. She got the truth on the record. She got her husband's real legacy preserved. She got justice. And in Harlem, in the neighborhood Bumpy protected for 40 years, people know which story is real. They know Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a stepping stone for Frank Lucas. He was the godfather of Harlem. And his story, the real story, is more powerful than any lie Hollywood could ever tell. If this story showed you the power of truth over lies, hit that like button. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Would you have had the courage to stand up like Mayme Johnson? To challenge a major Hollywood movie and expose the lies?